In the half-light of ancient China, long before the clang of modern cities or the flicker of cinema screens, there were bodies moving through mist, feet gripping cold earth, fists cutting the air with intention, and breath measured not merely to survive, but to understand the self. And it is here, in this primal convergence of survival, philosophy, violence, and discipline, that the story of Kung Fu begins, not as spectacle or myth, but as a living response to chaos, born from a world where order was fragile and the human body itself was both weapon and scripture. And as the listener is drawn backward through time, the landscape resolves into river valleys and mountain passes where early Chinese civilization struggled against famine, war, and nature, and where combat was inseparable from daily life. For in the Shang and Zhou dynasties, the art of fighting was already embedded in ritual, archery, wrestling, and chariot warfare, and the earliest texts spoke of strength, balance, and moral cultivation as intertwined ideals, because to fight well was not simply to strike harder, but to align oneself with heaven's mandate. And so martial practices were shaped by Confucian ideals of discipline and hierarchy, even as they were refined by Taoist concepts of flow, softness, and yielding, ideas that would later become inseparable from Kung Fu's deepest identity. And as centuries passed and the Warring States period plunged China into relentless conflict, soldiers, peasants, monks, and bandits all sought methods to survive in a fractured land. And it was in this crucible of constant war that systems of unarmed combat matured alongside weapons training, because weapons could be lost or broken, but the body, trained and conditioned, remained. And legends speak of early masters observing animals, the coiling strike of snakes, the explosive power of tigers, the balance of cranes, translating nature into movement, not as imitation, but as understanding. And while these stories were later embellished, they reflect a fundamental truth that Kung Fu evolved through observation, experimentation, and necessity rather than a single moment of invention. And yet no narrative of Kung Fu can avoid the shadowed silhouette of the Shaolin Temple, nestled on Mount Song, where history and myth intertwined so tightly that even scholars must tread carefully. Because when Buddhism arrived in China during the late Han Dynasty, it brought with it new ideas of suffering, enlightenment, and discipline. And when the Indian monk Bodhidharma is said to have arrived at Shaolin in the 5th or 6th century, exhausted monks reportedly struggled with long meditation sessions that weakened their bodies. And whether Bodhidharma truly introduced physical exercises, or whether later generations retroactively attributed this transformation to him, the result was the same. Shaolin became a crucible where spiritual practice and physical training fused. And over generations, the monks developed systems of movement that were not designed for aggression, but for defense, endurance, and mental clarity. And yet history is rarely pure, because China was never free from violence, and Shaolin itself was drawn into wars, rebellions, and imperial politics, with monks sometimes fighting as soldiers, sometimes as symbols. And their reputation spread, amplified by oral tradition, opera, and later literature, until Kung Fu Shaolin became synonymous with mastery itself, even as countless other styles were developing across China, each shaped by geography, culture, and circumstance, from the long, flowing movements favored in the open plains of the north to the compact, rapid techniques developed in the crowded southern villages, where space was limited and combat often occurred at close range. And so Kung Fu was never a single art, but a constellation of traditions, family lineages, and regional systems, each with its own philosophy, training methods, and tactical priorities. And as imperial dynasties rose and fell, martial arts reflected the anxieties of their times, because during periods of strong central control, martial training was often regulated or restricted, while during eras of collapse, such as the end of the Ming Dynasty, Kung Fu flourished among militias, secret societies, and rebel groups, becoming both a means of resistance and a language of identity. And it was in this environment that styles like Hung Gar, Wing Chun, and Choi Li Fut took shape, often associated with legends of anti-king resistance, burning temples, and wandering masters, stories that blended fact and fiction to preserve knowledge in an age where secrecy was survival. And as the Qing dynasty sought to consolidate power, martial artists were sometimes feared as threats to order, leading to crackdowns that paradoxically pushed kung fu further underground, where it was taught in opera troupes, clan halls, and marketplaces, disguised as performance or dance, ensuring its survival through adaptability. And this hidden transmission fostered an emphasis on practicality and efficiency because training time was limited and danger was constant. And while Kung Fu remained deeply Chinese in its philosophy, it was never static, absorbing influences from trade, migration, and internal exchange, evolving with each generation. And yet by the 19th century, as Western powers forced their way into China through war and unequal treaties, the traditional world that had nurtured Kung Fu began to fracture, because firearms rendered many traditional combat skills obsolete on the battlefield, and the humiliation of defeat triggered a crisis of identity, leading to reformers to both criticize and romanticize martial traditions. And during movements like the Boxer Rebellion, Kung Fu became entangled with mystical beliefs as practitioners claimed invulnerability through spiritual practice, a tragic collision of faith and modern weaponry that ended in devastation. And yet, even in failure, Kung Fu persisted as a symbol of resistance, dignity, and cultural memory. And as the Qing dynasty fell and the Republic of China emerged, martial arts underwent a process of modernization, with efforts to standardize training, promote physical fitness, and reframe Kung Fu as a national heritage rather than a relic of superstition. And institutions were founded to teach martial arts openly, emphasizing health, discipline, and patriotism, while masters from different lineages met, exchanged techniques, and sometimes clashed over legitimacy, because Kung Fu was no longer just about survival, but about identity in a rapidly changing world. And this transformation accelerated after the establishment of the People's Republic of China, when traditional practices were scrutinized under new ideological lenses. And during the Cultural Revolution, many masters were persecuted, lineages were broken, and training was driven underground once more, threatening centuries of accumulated knowledge. And yet history reveals a paradox, because while Kung Fu suffered at home, it began to spread abroad, carried by migration, cinema, and the charisma of individuals who embodied its power and philosophy. And nowhere was this more evident than in Hong Kong, where refugees from mainland China brought their arts, and where a burgeoning film industry transformed Kung Fu from lived practice into global spectacle. And when Bruce Lee burst onto the screen, he did more than perform techniques. He articulated a philosophy of adaptability, self-expression, and rejection of rigid dogma, challenging both Western stereotypes and traditional Chinese hierarchies. And his premature death only amplified his myth, cementing Kung Fu as a symbol of personal liberation and cultural pride. And after his wake, countless films, schools, and interpretations emerged, sometimes distorting history, but also igniting curiosity, leading millions to seek out training not to fight wars, but to understand themselves. And as Kung Fu spread across continents, it adapted once again, integrating with other martial arts, sports, and modern lifestyles, sometimes criticized for losing combat effectiveness, sometimes praised for preserving tradition. And this tension between preservation and evolution has always been central to Kung Fu's story, because at its core, Kung Fu is not a fixed set of movements, but a process, the cultivation of skill through time, patience, and struggle. And as the 21st century unfolds, with digital media compressing history into fragments, Kung Fu faces new challenges, from commercialization to cultural appropriation. Yet its enduring appeal lies in its depth, because beneath the choreography and legend remains a philosophy forged in hardship, a belief that mastery is earned through repetition, humility, and awareness. And when one traces the arc of Kung Fu from ancient battlefields to mountain temples, from secret societies to film sets, from persecuted practice to global phenomenon, what emerges is not merely a martial art, but a mirror of Chinese history itself, reflecting cycles of unity and fragmentation, suppression and revival, myth and reality. And as the narrative draws to its quiet conclusion, the image resolves once more to a lone practitioner standing at dawn, moving through forms learned from generations past, each motion carrying echoes of war, faith, resistance, and hope, reminding us that Kung Fu has never been about the fist alone, but about the human capacity to endure, adapt, and seek meaning through disciplined motion, a living history written not in books, but in bodies, breath, and time.